A man sat alone in the corner of an empty diner, two plates of food in front of him. He stared at the second plate like he was waiting for someone who would never come. Then a voice broke the silence, shaking, desperate. "Excuse me, my son is hungry. Can we stay here a while?" He looked up. A thin woman stood near the door, a small boy hiding behind her legs. The child's eyes held fear and hunger in equal measure. The man didn't know that his answer would open a story both of them had been searching for all along. The diner had been Terrence's Friday night ritual for 3 years now. Same corner booth, same two plates, same silence that felt heavier than any conversation. He was 42, though people said he looked older, the kind of tired that settles into your bones and doesn't leave. His dark brown skin seemed to have aged overnight after the accident. New lines forming around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He worked as a mechanic, fixing motorcycles in a small shop on the east side of town. Good with his hands, quiet with his words, the kind of man people forgot about the moment he left a room, except on Friday nights when he became the man everyone pitied. The waitress, an older woman named Rosa, knew better than to ask questions anymore. She'd bring 2 plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, set them down without a word, and leave him alone. The first few times she'd tried to talk to him, asked if someone was joining him. Terrence had just looked at the empty seat across from him and said nothing. After a while, she stopped asking. The second plate was for his son, a boy who would have been 10 years old now if the pickup truck had stopped at the red light 3 years ago. A boy with his father's warm brown eyes and bright smile who used to love Friday night dinners at this exact booth, who'd always order extra gravy and make a mess of the table. The small blue backpack still hung on the edge of the booth. Terrence never moved it. Sometimes he'd reach over and touch the strap just to remember what it felt like to have someone to take care of. People in the neighborhood knew his story. They'd look at him with that careful kind of sympathy that made him feel like a ghost. Some avoided him entirely. Others would nod and say nothing, which was worse somehow. A few had told him to move on, to let go, to stop torturing himself with these weekly dinners. But they didn't understand. This wasn't torture. This was the only hour of the week when his son still felt real. Tonight was no different. Terrence sat with his hands folded on the table, staring at the untouched plate in front of the empty seat. The meatloaf was getting cold. He'd wait another 10 minutes like always, then ask Rosa to box it up. He'd take it home and throw it away, same as every week. But then the door opened. A woman stepped inside, thin and pale, wearing a coat 2 sizes too big. Behind her, half hidden, was a boy, maybe 6 years old. His clothes were dirty, his face smudged with something that might have been tears or just exhaustion. The woman didn't come all the way in. She stood near the doorway, looking around like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be there. The boy clung to her leg. Rosa saw them and frowned. She walked over, drying her hands on her apron. "Can I help you?" she asked, not unkindly, but with the tone of someone who'd seen too many people come in without money. The woman's voice was barely a whisper. Is it okay if we sit down for a minute, just to rest?" Rosa glanced at the boy, then back at the woman. "This is a restaurant, hun. You need to order something if you want to sit." "I know, the woman's voice cracked. "We don't have anything right now. I'm sorry." Rosa's expression softened, but she didn't move. "I can't let you stay if you're not ordering. Owner's rules." The boy looked up at his mother, and something in his eyes, hunger, fear, shame, hit Terrence like a fist to the chest. He stood up before he could think about it. "They're with me," he said, his deep voice carrying across the quiet diner. Rosa turned, surprised. The woman looked at him like she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. Terrence gestured to the booth. "Come sit down." The woman hesitated. "We can't. We don't want to bother you." "You're not," Terrence said. He looked at the boy, then at the second plate of food growing cold on the table. "Please." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She guided her son to the booth, and they slid into the seat across from Terrence. The boy stared at the plate of food like it was a mirage. Terrence pushed it toward him. "Go ahead." The boy looked at his mother. She nodded, her hand trembling as she touched his shoulder. He picked up the fork and started eating, fast and desperate, like he wasn't sure the food would still be there if he slowed down. The woman wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "We'll pay you back, I promise." Terrence shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." Rosa brought over a glass of water and set it in front of the boy without a word. She met Terrence's eyes for just a moment, something unreadable passing between them, then walked away. For a while, no one spoke. The boy ate. The woman kept her head down, her hands folded in her lap like she was praying. Terrence watched them and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years, something that wasn't emptiness. When the boy finally slowed down, his plate nearly clean, he looked up at Terrence with wide, grateful eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. Terrence's throat tightened. The boy's voice sounded so much like his son's. The woman reached across the table, hesitant. "I'm Sarah," she said, "and this is Elijah." Terrence nodded. "Terrence." She tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. We're not usually like this, we just..." She trailed off, looking down at her hands. "Things got hard. We're trying to figure it out." Terrence didn't ask for details. He'd learned a long time ago that some stories were too heavy to tell to strangers. "Where are you staying?" he asked instead. Sarah's face tightened. We'll find somewhere." That meant nowhere. Terrence looked at Elijah, who was leaning against his mother's side now, his eyes starting to close. The boy looked so small, so tired. He thought about the second plate, about the empty seat, about the 3 years he'd spent pretending his son was still sitting there. Maybe it was time to stop pretending. "I have a shop," Terrence said. "I fix motorcycles. There's a small room in the back. Not much, but it's dry and it's warm. You can stay there, just for tonight." Sarah's eyes went wide. "We couldn't..." "It's not charity," Terrence said, cutting her off gently. "I just have the space and it's cold out." She looked at him like she was trying to figure out if he was real. Then she looked at Elijah, who'd fallen asleep against her shoulder, and something in her broke. "Okay," she whispered. "Just for tonight." Terrence paid the bill and led them out to his truck. Elijah was half asleep, stumbling, so Terrence picked him up without thinking. The boy was light, too light, and he smelled like rain and unwashed clothes. Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, and they drove in silence through the empty streets. The shop was only 10 minutes away. A squat brick building with a metal garage door and a faded sign that said, "Terrence's Motors." Inside, it smelled like oil and metal and old concrete. Terrence led them past the motorcycles in various states of repair, through a narrow hallway to a small room in the back. It had a cot, a space heater, and a pile of old blankets. "It's not much," Terrence said, setting Elijah down on the cot. The boy didn't wake up. Sarah stood in the doorway looking around like she still couldn't believe this was happening. "Why are you doing this?" Terrence didn't know how to answer that. He looked at the boy, curled up on the cot, and thought about the blue backpack hanging in the diner booth. "Because someone should," he said finally. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't wipe them away. "Thank you," she whispered. Terrence nodded and turned to leave, but as he reached the door, Sarah spoke again. "I will pay you back," she said, her voice stronger now. "I don't know how, but I will." Terrence looked back at her. "You don't have to." But even as he said it, he wondered if maybe she wasn't the only one who needed saving. He didn't know that this decision, this one moment of saying yes instead of no, would unravel everything he thought he knew about grief, about family, about what it meant to keep living when the person you loved most was gone. He didn't know that by opening his door, he was about to step into the hardest and most important chapter of his life. All he knew was that for the first time in 3 years, the second plate hadn't gone to waste. Sarah and Elijah stayed for 3 days before Terrence realized they had nowhere else to go. He hadn't asked, she hadn't offered, but on the fourth morning, when he came into the shop early and found Sarah already awake, scrubbing the oil stains off the concrete floor with a rag and a bucket of soapy water, he understood. "You don't have to do that," Terrence said. Sarah looked up, her hands red and raw. "I need to do something. You've already done too much." Elijah was still asleep in the back room, curled under the pile of blankets. Terrence could see him through the doorway, small and still. "You looking for work?" Terrence asked. Sarah stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I'll take anything." He made a call to Rosa at the diner. She needed someone in the kitchen washing dishes and prepping vegetables. It didn't pay much, but it was something. Sarah started the next day. Terrence told himself it was temporary, a week, maybe 2, just until she got back on her feet. But weeks turned into a month, and Sarah and Elijah became part of the rhythm of his life in a way he hadn't expected. Elijah would sit in the corner of the shop after school doing homework on an overturned crate while Terrence worked on engines. Sometimes the boy would ask questions. Why did motorcycles need oil? How did the gears work? What made them go fast? Terrence answered them all, his patient voice steady as he explained things, surprised at how easy it was to talk to a child again. Sarah worked long hours at the diner, but she always came back to the shop at night. She'd bring leftovers from the kitchen, and the 3 of them would eat together in the back room. It wasn't much, but it felt like something Terrence hadn't had in years. It felt like a routine, like a life. But the neighbors noticed. Mrs. Washington from the apartment building next door was the first to say something. She cornered Terrence one afternoon while he was carrying groceries from his truck. "I don't mean to pry," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But that woman and her boy, they've been here a while now, haven't they?" Terrence shifted the grocery bag in his arms. "They needed a place to stay." Mrs. Washington's lips pressed into a thin line. "People talk, Terrence. A black man living alone with a white woman and her child. It doesn't look right to some folks." "I'm not worried about how it looks," Terrence said quietly. But after she walked away, he found himself wondering if maybe he should be. He'd lived in this neighborhood long enough to know how people could twist things, how quickly help could be misunderstood. The whispers started small. A few glances at the diner when Sarah served tables. A comment from one of Terrence's customers about the boy who was always hanging around the shop. Nothing outright cruel, but enough to remind him that people were watching. Then one evening, Rosa pulled him aside after he'd come to pick up Sarah. "I like her," Rosa said, nodding toward Sarah, who was wiping down the counter. "She works hard, but you need to be careful, Terrence." "Careful of what?" Rosa glanced around, then lowered her voice. "People are saying things about you two, about why she's staying with you." Terrence felt his jaw tighten. "She's staying because she has nowhere else to go." "I know that," Rosa said gently. "But not everyone does. And some folks, they think you're either being taken advantage of or you're taking advantage. Either way, it's not going to end well if you're not careful." Terrence wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Because late at night when he lay awake in his apartment above the shop, he'd started asking himself the same questions. Was he helping Sarah because it was the right thing to do? Or was he using her and Elijah to fill the hole his son had left behind? He didn't have an answer. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. Elijah had been quiet all afternoon, sitting in his usual corner, but not doing his homework. When Sarah came to pick him up, the boy's face was flushed, his eyes glassy. "He's warm," Sarah said, pressing her hand to his forehead. Her voice was tight with worry. Terrence touched Elijah's forehead. The heat radiating from the boy's skin sent a spike of fear through his chest. "We need to take him to the hospital." Sarah's face went pale. "I don't have insurance. I can't." "I'll pay," Terrence said, already grabbing his keys. They drove to the emergency room in silence. Elijah slumped against his mother in the back seat. Terrence gripped the steering wheel and tried not to think about the last time he'd been in a hospital, 3 years ago, when the doctors had told him there was nothing they could do. At the ER, they waited for 2 hours before a doctor finally examined Elijah. The boy had a fever of 103 degrees, a bad infection that needed antibiotics. The doctor wrote a prescription and told them to monitor him closely. The bill came to $470. Terrence paid it without hesitation. On the drive back, Sarah cried silently in the passenger seat. Elijah was asleep in the back, the fever already starting to break thanks to the medicine. "I can't keep doing this to you," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. Terrence kept his eyes on the road. "You're not doing anything to me?" "Yes, I am." She wiped her face with her sleeve. "You've given us a place to stay, helped me find work, and now this, and I have nothing to give you back." "I don't want anything back." Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes red and swollen. "Why are you doing this, Terrence? Really? Because no one just helps people like this. Not without wanting something." Terrence didn't answer right away. He thought about the blue backpack still hanging in the diner booth, about the second plate of food he'd ordered every Friday for 3 years, about the way Elijah's laugh sounded so much like his son's. "Because you needed help," he said finally, "and because I know what it's like to feel like the world forgot about you." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, then looked away. "I had a daughter," she said quietly, "before Elijah. She was born too early, lived for 3 days. Terrence's hands tightened on the wheel. "Her name was Emma," Sarah continued, "and when she died, my husband blamed me, said it was my fault for not taking care of myself, for being too stressed. He started drinking, then he started hitting me." She looked down at her hands. "I stayed for 2 years because I didn't know where else to go. Then one night, he hit Elijah, and I knew we had to leave." Terrence felt something crack open in his chest. "I'm sorry." "I'm not telling you this for pity," Sarah said. "I'm telling you because I need you to understand. I know what it's like to lose someone, and I know what it's like to feel like you're using someone else to fill that space." She looked at him, her eyes fierce despite the tears. "So, if that's what you're doing, if you're helping us because Elijah reminds you of your son, I need you to tell me now, because I can't let him get attached to someone who's going to disappear when they realize he's not a replacement." Terrence pulled the truck over to the side of the road. He turned off the engine and sat there, staring at the dashboard, his dark hands gripping the wheel. "I lost my son 3 years ago," he said. His voice felt like gravel. "Drunk driver ran a red light. He was 7. And yeah, when I look at Elijah, I see him. I hear him, and for the first time in 3 years, I don't feel like I'm drowning." He looked at Sarah. "So maybe you're right. Maybe I am using you. But I don't think that's all this is. Because when I look at you, I don't see someone I'm trying to save. I see someone who's trying to save herself. And I think maybe we're both just trying to figure out how to keep going." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't look away. "I don't want to hurt him," she whispered. "Or you." "Then don't leave," Terrence said. "Not yet. Not until we figure this out." She nodded, and they sat there in the truck, the engine ticking as it cooled, Elijah asleep in the back seat. But the peace didn't last. 2 weeks later, a man showed up at the shop. Terrence was under a motorcycle, his hands covered in grease, when he heard the garage door open. He slid out from under the bike and saw a man standing in the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been in too many fights. "Can I help you?" Terrence asked, standing up, wiping his hands on a rag. The man looked around the shop, his eyes cold. "I'm looking for my wife." Terrence's stomach dropped. "I think you've got the wrong place." "Sarah Patterson," the man said, "and my son, Elijah. Someone told me they've been staying here." Terrence didn't move. If they were here, I don't think they'd want to see you. The man's jaw tightened. That's not your decision to make. She's my wife. He's my son. And I'm taking them home. She's not your wife anymore, Terrence said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. And she left because you hurt her. The man stepped closer, his hands curling into fists. You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough. They stared at each other, the air thick with tension. Then the man smiled, and it was the ugliest thing Terrence had ever seen. You think you're some kind of hero? The man said. Playing house with my family. She's using you, buddy. And when she's done, she'll leave you just like she left me. He looked Terrence up and down with disgust. Think a guy like you is going to play daddy to my kid? You're out of your mind. Terrence didn't flinch. Get out of my shop. The man didn't move. I'll be back with a lawyer if I have to. And when I am, you better hope you've got a good reason for keeping a man from his son. He turned and walked out, and Terrence stood there, his hands shaking, staring at the empty doorway. That night, Sarah didn't come back to the shop. Terrence called the diner. Rosa said Sarah had left early, said she wasn't feeling well. He tried her cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. He drove to the motel on the edge of town, the only place he could think of where she might go. Her car was parked outside one of the rooms. He knocked on the door. No answer. Sarah, it's Terrence. Open the door. After a long moment, the door cracked open. Sarah stood there, her face pale, her eyes red. Elijah sat on the bed behind her, clutching a pillow. We have to go, Sarah said. Her voice was flat. He found us. If we stay, he'll take Elijah or hurt you, or both. Terrence shook his head. You can't run forever. I'm not running forever, Sarah said. I'm just running now. She tried to close the door, but Terrence caught it. Let me help. You've already helped too much, Sarah said, and there was something broken in her voice. And I can't keep dragging you into this. Terrence looked past her at Elijah, who was staring at him with wide, frightened eyes. The boy looked so small, so scared. Please, Terrence said. Just come back to the shop. We'll figure this out. Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, Terrence. For everything. She closed the door. Terrence stood there in the motel parking lot, the cold night air biting at his skin, and felt the familiar weight of loss settle over him like a blanket. He'd thought he was saving them, but maybe all he'd done was make things worse. The next morning, Terrence went to the shop and found a drawing on the workbench. It was done in crayon, the lines shaky but deliberate. 3 stick figures stood in front of a building that was clearly the shop. A tall man with dark skin, a woman, and a small boy. At the bottom, in Elijah's careful handwriting, were 3 words, Thank you, Terrence. Terrence sat down on the floor, the drawing in his hands, and for the first time in 3 years he cried. Not because he'd lost someone, but because he'd found them, and now they were gone. Terrence sat in the empty shop for 2 days, staring at Elijah's drawing. He didn't work, didn't eat, just sat there with the crayon lines blurring in front of him until he couldn't tell if he was looking at the paper or just the memory of it. On the 3rd day, Rosa called. Sarah didn't show up for her shift, she said. Again. Terrence's chest tightened. Did she call? No. And her phone's been going straight to voicemail since yesterday. Rosa's voice dropped lower. Terrence, I'm worried. This isn't like her. He was already reaching for his keys. The motel manager said Sarah had checked out 2 days ago, paid in cash, didn't leave a forwarding address. Terrence drove to every motel, every shelter, every cheap hotel within 20 miles. No one had seen her. By nightfall, he was back at the shop, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had gone white. He didn't know what to do, didn't know where else to look. Then his phone rang. Unknown number. Hello. Heavy breathing on the other end. Then a small, terrified voice. Terrence. His heart stopped. Elijah. The boy's words came out in a rush, barely coherent. He found us. Mom told me to hide, but I heard them fighting, and there's yelling, and I'm scared, and I don't know what to do. Where are you? Terrence was already starting the truck. The old apartment on Oakwood Street, the one with the blue door. Elijah's voice cracked. Please come. Please. The line went dead. Terrence drove faster than he should have, his mind racing through every terrible possibility. He knew Oakwood Street was on the south side, the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business, even when they shouldn't. He found the building, a sagging two-story structure with peeling paint and broken gutters. The blue door was on the first floor, slightly ajar. Terrence pushed it open. The apartment was small and dark, the air thick with the smell of alcohol and something else. Fear. He heard voices from the back room, a man shouting, a woman pleading. Terrence moved quickly down the narrow hallway, his pulse hammering in his ears. The bedroom door was half open. Through the gap he could see Sarah backed against the wall, her lip bleeding, her hands raised in front of her face. The man, her ex-husband, stood over her, one fist clenched, the other holding her wrist in a grip that was turning her skin white. "You think you can just take my son and run?" the man was saying, his voice thick with rage. "You think some loser mechanic is going to protect you?" Terrence didn't think. He just moved. He shoved the door open and stepped inside. The man spun around, his eyes wild. For a moment, they just stared at each other. "Get out of my house," the man said. "Let her go," Terrence said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Or what? You going to hit me? Go ahead. Give me a reason to call the cops and have you arrested." Terrence took a step forward. "I said, let her go." The man released Sarah's wrist and turned fully toward Terrence. He was bigger, younger, and Terrence could see the coiled violence in his posture. This was a man who'd hurt people before and would do it again without hesitation. "You want to be a hero?" the man said, moving closer. "Fine. Let's see how that works out for you." He swung. Terrence barely dodged the first punch. The second one caught him in the ribs, and he felt something crack. Pain exploded through his side, but he didn't go down. He shoved the man back hard, and they crashed into the dresser. Sarah screamed. Terrence heard footsteps in the hallway, neighbors maybe, or just curious onlookers. The man swung again, and this time Terrence caught his arm, twisted it, and used the momentum to drive him into the wall. The man's head hit the plaster with a dull thud, and he staggered back, dazed. Terrence stood there, breathing hard, his ribs screaming in protest. Then he heard the sirens. Someone had called the police. 2 officers arrived within minutes, their hands on their holsters as they stepped into the apartment. They separated Terrence and the ex-husband, took statements, examined Sarah's bleeding lip and the bruises forming on her wrist. The ex-husband tried to spin a story about how Terrence had broken into his apartment, attacked him unprovoked. But the neighbors had heard the fighting, and when the officers found Elijah hiding in the closet, shaking and crying, the boy's testimony sealed it. They arrested the ex-husband for domestic assault, read him his rights, let him out in handcuffs while he shouted threats over his shoulder. One of the officers, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, sat down with Sarah at the kitchen table. "You need to file for a restraining order," she said gently, "and we'll need to document everything for the custody case." Sarah nodded, her hands trembling. "I don't have a lawyer. I can't afford—" "There are resources," the officer said. "Shelters, legal aid. I'll get you the information." She looked at Terrence, who was leaning against the wall, holding his ribs. "You should get that looked at." "I'm fine," Terrence said, though he wasn't sure that was true. The officer gave him a long, measuring look. "You did a good thing tonight, but you need to be smart about what comes next. Cases like this get complicated fast." After the police left, Terrence drove Sarah and Elijah back to the shop. No one spoke. Elijah sat in the back seat, his face pale and streaked with tears. Sarah stared out the window, her hand pressed against her mouth. Inside the shop, Terrence made them tea. Sarah sat on the cot in the back room. Elijah curled up beside her, and they didn't move for a long time. Finally, Sarah looked at Terrence. "Why did you come?" "Because Elijah called me." She closed her eyes. "I told him not to. I told him we'd be fine." "You weren't fine," Terrence said quietly. "I know." Her voice broke. "I thought if we just stayed away from you, he'd leave us alone. I thought I was protecting you." Terrence sat down on the floor, his back against the wall. His ribs throbbed with every breath. "You don't have to protect me." "Yes, I do." Sarah looked at him, her eyes red. "Because if something happened to you because of us, I'd never forgive myself." Elijah stirred, lifting his head from his mother's lap. "You came," he said, looking at Terrence. His voice was small and fragile. "You came even though we left." Terrence felt his throat tighten. "Of course I did." The boy started crying again, and Sarah pulled him close, and Terrence sat there on the cold concrete floor, feeling like his heart was being torn in two. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers and court dates and paperwork. Terrence used every connection he had, called in every favor. He vouched for Sarah, offered the shop as a stable residence, wrote letters testifying to her character. The community surprisingly rallied. Rosa wrote a letter. Mrs. Washington, despite her earlier misgivings, spoke to the judge about Sarah's work ethic and Terrence's kindness. Even some of Terrence's customers stepped forward, people who'd seen Sarah and Elijah at the shop and could attest that they were being cared for. It wasn't easy. The ex-husband fought for custody, hired a lawyer, tried to paint Sarah as an unfit mother, but the evidence was against him. The police reports, the hospital records, Elijah's own testimony. In the end, the judge granted Sarah full custody with a 5-year restraining order. The ex-husband was ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from Sarah and Elijah at all times. When the verdict came down, Sarah broke down in the courthouse hallway. Not from relief, though that was part of it, but from the weight of everything she'd been carrying finally lifting. Terrence stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, and didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. That night, they went back to the shop. Elijah fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the long day. Sarah and Terrence sat in the main work area, surrounded by tools and motorcycle parts, drinking coffee that had gone cold. "I don't know how to thank you," Sarah said. "You don't have to." She looked at him, really looked at him. "You could have walked away so many times, but you didn't." Terrence stared at his hands. "I tried to. That night at the motel. I thought maybe I was making things worse. You weren't. I know that now." He looked up at her. "But I also know that I wasn't just helping you. I was helping myself. And I'm not sure that makes me a good person." Sarah shook her head. "It makes you human. We both lost children. We both know what it's like to feel like the world ended and kept going anyway. And maybe we found each other because we needed to learn how to live with that." She was right. Terrence knew she was right, but it still felt complicated, messy, like they were both using each other and healing each other at the same time. "What happens now?" he asked. "I don't know," Sarah said, "but I think we figure it out together." 3 months later, Terrence went back to the diner on a Friday night, but this time he wasn't alone. Sarah sat across from him, and Elijah sat in the seat where the blue backpack used to hang. The backpack was still there. Terrence hadn't moved it. But now there was a second one beside it, red and new, belonging to Elijah. Rosa brought 3 plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. She set them down with a knowing smile and didn't say a word. They ate together, the 3 of them, and the diner felt warmer somehow. Less like a place Terrence came to remember the past, and more like a place where the future was beginning. Elijah talked about school, about a science project he was working on. Sarah talked about her new job at a better restaurant downtown, one with benefits and decent pay. Terrence listened and realized he was smiling. Really smiling. For the first time in years. The lines around his eyes softened as he watched them. After dinner, they walked back to the truck. The night was cold, the stars bright overhead. Elijah ran ahead, his red backpack bouncing on his shoulders. Sarah walked beside Terrence, their hands almost touching, but not quite. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the dinner, for everything." Terrence looked at her. "You know, you don't have to keep thanking me." "I know," she said, "but I want to." They drove back to the shop in comfortable silence. Elijah fell asleep in the back seat, his head resting against the window. Sarah looked back at him, her expression soft. "He asked me the other day if you were going to be his dad," she said. Terrence's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that family doesn't always look the way we expect it to, but that doesn't make it any less real." Terrence didn't respond. He couldn't, because the truth was, he didn't know what they were. Didn't know if he could ever be a father again, or if Sarah could ever be more than someone he'd helped. But he knew this. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel alone, and maybe that was enough. Back at the shop, Terrence carried Elijah inside and laid him on the cot. The boy didn't wake up. Sarah covered him with a blanket and stood there for a moment, watching him sleep. Terrence stood in the doorway, and Sarah turned to look at him. "Stay," she said. Not a question, just a simple request. So he did. They sat together in the workshop, surrounded by the smell of oil and metal, and talked about nothing important, about the weather, about Elijah's science project, about the new coffee shop that had opened down the street. And slowly, without either of them noticing, the conversation shifted. They talked about the people they'd lost, about the children they'd never stop missing, about the guilt and the grief and the impossibility of moving forward when part of you was still stuck in the past. "I used to think I'd never feel whole again," Sarah said, "like there was this piece of me missing that I could never get back." "And now?" Terrence asked. She looked at him. "Now, I think maybe that's okay. Maybe we're not supposed to be whole. Maybe we're just supposed to keep going anyway." Terrence thought about his son, about the blue backpack, about the second plate of food he'd ordered every Friday for 3 years. He thought about the hole that loss had left in his chest, and how it would never fully close, but also how it had made room for something new, something unexpected. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Maybe you're right." Outside, the city slept. Inside the shop, 2 broken people sat together in the dim light, learning how to breathe again. And that was enough, because grief doesn't disappear. It just learns to share space with hope, with kindness, with the small, stubborn belief that even when the world takes everything from you, there's still a reason to keep showing up. Terrence didn't replace his son. Sarah didn't forget her daughter. But they learned that you can hold on to what you've lost and still reach for what's in front of you. Family isn't always the people you're born with. Sometimes it's the people who show up when you need them most. The ones who sit with you in the dark and don't try to fix you. The ones who understand that healing isn't about moving on. It's about learning to carry your grief without letting it crush you. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, healing looks like a single father sitting in a diner with 2 plates of food, waiting for someone who will never come, until one day, someone else does.